I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. And Wright Thompson, yeah, you know his name from ESPN. You also know his name from a book that we picked as one of our monthly nonfiction picks called Pappyland. But we're going in a new direction with The Barn. And before we get too deep into the story, Wright, I'm going to ask you to set up the location. I'm going to ask you to talk about the town you grew up in and also the surrounding landscape, because I think it's really key to understanding a big piece of what you're doing here.
So I'm from Clarksdale, Mississippi, which is a farming town in the Mississippi Delta. Until late 1880s, most of where I'm from was actually an uninhabitable hardwood swamp. So, until about 1900, the major life insurance companies wouldn't even offer life insurance policies if you lived there. And I say all that to say that it's important to know that the landscape is man-made and that human beings created this. And that my family farm is south of Clarksdale, and 23 miles from my family farm is the barn where Emmett Till was killed.
And the thing that I didn't really understand until I read your book, and I grew up in the Northeast. I grew up learning about Emmett Till and his mother Mamie and the decisions she made. I grew up knowing the names of the people who murdered him and the decisions that were made and everything else. But what I didn't understand is how lost the story was in the place where it happened. And I'm still, I've read the book a couple of times now, and I'm still sort of walking around shaking off that piece of information. I shouldn't be shocked, and yet I don't understand. I can understand older folks not necessarily wanting to talk. I mean, I grew up around New Englanders. They don't want to talk about anything, especially the bad stuff. But how in the world do you have someone you knew in high school who didn't know who Emmett Till was until 1995 when he read about it in the newspaper because there was an anniversary?
I didn't know who Emmett Till was until I left the state to go to college.
Okay.
There wasn't he certainly wasn't taught in our Mississippi history class. And also, it's an incredibly well-known murder that was incredibly symbolically important, but it's also sort of shockingly unknown. I mean, many of the major facts are in dispute. There's been an active attempt locally and nationally to erase it for a variety of reasons. I mean, if the book has a central conflict, it has many, but one of the central conflicts is the eternal existential battle between erasure and memory.
Right. Part of what I really appreciate, too, in The Barn is you take your time and you dig in deep on the history. You dig in deep on the details. I mean, I know more about the terrain and the map coordinates and how Mississippi made its money. I'd always understood that King Cotton, right? The whole
Yes.
King Cotton and where the money came from. I didn't realize that there was a logging industry that also came out of Mississippi. I think I just always thought of Mississippi as farmland and bayou, which, again, grew up in the Northeast.
Well, it's interesting because Mississippi has always been sort of a colony of New York, Manchester, Liverpool, and London. And so, that's a really good way to look at it. When cotton was oil, Mississippi was Saudi Arabia.
Got it.
Which makes the clan ISIS. But anyway, but really, it's the same patterns over and over again. And so there's so much money flowing into Mississippi and almost none of it staying in Mississippi. One of the things we found is that in places where land is worth the most, human life seems to be worth the least.
Right.
And so the barn sits on Township 22 North, Range 4 West, measured from the Choctaw Meridian, which becomes important because the structure of the book is, and I think this is vital to its overall mission of trying to play with the idea of time not being linear. So we tell the story of the murder in which it's totally incomprehensible, and it's set entirely inside Township 22 North, Range 4 West, which is where it happened. And then we go back literally to the beginning of time and explain how a barn got here and how all of these people came into intersection. And it takes us back to 1955, and we tell the story of the murder again, except this time, as opposed to you saying, how could this ever have happened? The question is a unbelievably sort of menacing, how could it not have?
And it's how could it not have that? Yeah, that's the most accurate description.
It's, one of the things is it deals a lot with forces and with systems that led to this, but as opposed to sort of like a lot of things do that I don't like, where they lay everything at the feet of forces as if human beings didn't have free will. Well, this was just forces. It was macroeconomic. Somebody still had to go rip a child out of bed. And so the thing I think is interesting is that the book tries to draw as one of its arcs concentric and expanding circles of blame. So, like, the dentist who owns the barn where the murder happened, it's just his barn. He's a guy named Jeff Andrews. I actually really like him. He's really nice, thoughtful, been really kind to the Till family members who want to go out there. Like, it's just a good guy. And yet he barbecues steaks and drinks Bud Light within eyesight of this. And so for a long time, and this is super judgy, but I was like, how could he do that? Which of course brings up the existential question, which is, well, how far enough away is far enough?
Right.
Is it across the road? Is it the next county? Is it the next state? Is 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue far enough? How far is far enough away? And so one of the things that I also like is, I think it's Malcolm X, everything south of Canada is the South. You want the expanding circles of blame, so that I tried to over and over point the reader to every person and situation where someone could have stopped this killing over 1,000 years. And you just see how many people could have. And, when a telling of an American history, we want it to be good versus evil, bad people and good people. And over again, it's just brave people and cowards.
Obviously, I didn't grow up in Mississippi. I grew up in the Northeast. And, we have our own issues in the North. Right. I grew up in Massachusetts. You want to talk Thanksgiving to a lesser or a different extent, let's say. I've been fed fairy tales my entire history. Crispus Attucks, yep, first man to die, when the American Revolution kicked off. And yet somehow we still get busing. So I'm certainly not throwing stones anywhere. But what I'm trying to understand is sort of this mass willfulness to say, well, the past is the past and that's it. And yet you're pulling in the whole economic situation, right?
100%. And so one, it's not that the past is the past so much as it is that the most important coin of the realm in Mississippi is the creation and perpetuation of the myth. People would rather lose their family land than their myth. They would rather lose their home than their myth. And so one of the things, that's an existential attack, whether it has to do with class or race. It could be about anything. When it's about those big things, that's gasoline on the fire. And so, you have the myth must be protected at all costs. And, Mississippi didn't really integrate its schools until 1970.
Right.
And so there's a parallel, they call them SEG academies. There's a parallel school system in the Mississippi Delta whose chief function was to sort of teach the gospel that there were mostly good white people and there were a few bad white people, so that the conversation is never framed there were a few brave people and many cowardly people. Because you don't get psychopathic murderers like Roy Bryan and J.W. Milam unless their actions are ignored and excused.
Right.
Those guys can't operate unless the ground has been fertilized by, my mom is incredibly politically active on Facebook, and she lives alone, and some of these people are crazy that she's fighting with. And I'm always like, who cares? First of all, who cares what someone on the internet thinks? I'm just sort of it doesn't matter. I've worked at ESPN long enough to whatever. Nobody's nastier on the internet than sports fans. So maybe I'm just used to it. But I asked her, I'm what are you doing? And she said, I was born in 1947 and I knew what was happening around me was wrong. And we just never said anything. And I just told myself that if I ever had the chance again, I would never be silent.
Your mom is 6 years younger than Emmett Till.
Yeah, I know. And was living She was 8 years old in 1955.
Okay.
Had just turned 8, and she lived 20 miles from where it happened and didn't know anything about it.
I mean, Emmett Till would have turned 83 years old this year.
I know. And one of, if not the most powerful person in the story is a Church of God in Christ minister in suburban Chicago named Wheeler Parker.
Yep.
He should just be on money. Like, and he was Emmett's next door neighbor, cousin, best friend, rode the train south with him in 1955, was in the house the night he was kidnapped. And so, he sits at, there probably still 10 or 12 people left alive when I started doing this who actually knew Emmett Till. And that number is probably 8 now. I'm making that up. I don't actually have a count. At 8, they've been dying. And so one of the things that's really fascinating is that when you meet Wheeler, you realize that, yes, this is a murder that happened to a country, but it's also a murder that happened and continues to happen to a family. And, these are all actual people and they're still alive. I mean, Wheeler Parker is alive and he was in the house. Those guys pointed the gun at him first. And so this isn't ancient history. I went to the African American History Museum with Wheeler Parker, and we went down to the Emmett Till exhibit. When he walked out, he was just making noises. And you just realize, like, it hurts him to relive it every day. And yet he made a promise to Mamie that he wouldn't let people forget. I mean, the fourth act of the book is called Tomorrow. The first 3 acts are about erasure. The fourth act is about memory and the power it has to defeat erasure.
When you say Wheeler Parker's name, part of what I think of is the fact that he knew Emmett Till as his cousin Bobo.
That's right.
Bobo's a child's name. It's a child's name. It's a child's nickname. And I can't stop thinking about that.
And the fact that he had just turned 14.
Mm-hmm.
He was overweight with a stutter. And he couldn't work in the cotton fields with his cousin because he was too soft. So he was having to help his aunt in the kitchen. So, he'd gone down to Mississippi and been totally emasculated. And so you understand why he might have been showing off at the store. So it's heartbreaking. He was a child. It's a child's name. I mean, one of the great details, the Steelworkers Union deserves incredible kudos because they went to war for Emmett Till.
Yep.
And I think it was Mr. Moody, lived in the south side of Chicago and knew Mamie. And he was one of the big union leaders. And he comes in and Mamie is weeping and she keeps saying they took Emmett. And he's like, who's Emmett? And she's like, Bobo. They took Bobo. Because that's what everybody called him.
Mm-hmm.
He said the blood ran out of his face. And I mean, the Steelworkers Union went to war. I mean, they called Mayor Daley, who called the governor of Illinois, who called the governor of Mississippi, and that happened really quickly. And so, those folks, God bless them, man. They went to work.
And Mamie Till went from being a single mother who wanted to make sure her kid was safe and, ready to be out in the world. You've got some really lovely stories in there that I'm not going to put all of them on the air because I really want people to be able to experience Emmett the way Mamie did. But also she knows what she has to do when her child is murdered.
Which she demands that everyone see. And she was really shy and she had the child so young that to a lot of folks in the family, Alma, her mother, was the parent. And it was almost like Mamie and Emmett were brother and sister. And that all changed. And, she really stunned a lot of people. She taught young kids. She was like an elementary school teacher, which isn't an accident. That's a job she did not have until after he died. She spent not some of her life, she spent her whole life making sure that people don't forget and deputized people in the family to continue. I mean, I got asked just not that long ago, was this traumatic to do? No, because I've met people who were there. I've met people who made deathbed promises to Mamie Till that they would never let people forget. This is not my story. This is not, and I'm not falsely modest. If I'm writing a story about Michael Jordan, that's my story. So I don't want to imply, like, I'm not falsely modest. You are a caretaker of this. People will be writing about Emmett Till for 200 years. It brings me great joy to think about someone 70 years from now having my book on a stack of books with Devery Anderson and Christopher Benson, and find everything I messed up and corrected, and then strip it for parts and push the story further. Like, I find great joy in the fact that this book is but part of an attempt to understand this one murder. And, my hope for it is that the history of America is too mythologized and too big to hold in your hand. If you can shrink it to 36 square miles, you can hold it in your hand. And you start seeing the economic and social and political intersections in just this 36 square block of land. And it allows you to see one barn, which allows you to see all the barns. It allows you to see one act of violence, just allows you to see every act of violence. I mean, the thing that is terrifying for me that I still like, it's terrible. Mississippi, dude, it is full of barns. All I do now is every time I look at a barn, I think, I wonder what happened there I don't know about. And I would like people who read it, whether you live in Mississippi or you live in Maine or you live in Sonoma County, California, like, I would like it to be a story about your 36 square miles too. I mean, and have that universal thing. Like, we go deep on one square to talk about all of them. And I would like it to be a roadmap for people to think about how to interrogate where they're from.
Yeah, I got to say, when I was learning about the timber in Mississippi, you had me thinking about the Adirondacks, and you had me thinking about Northern California and Western North Carolina and all of these places that we do sort of much more, or the Pacific Northwest, or, deep in Minnesota and Michigan, like places that we associate much more with logging. I mean, again, like, I do have these ideas of the Mississippi Delta that are much more sort of farmland and fishing and much more agrarian. And certainly with cotton, cotton defines everything. And when you said Mississippi was sort of the Saudi Arabia when cotton was...
I mean, until 1933 in the DuPont laboratories, cotton was the most valuable commodity in the world. And then almost overnight, it wasn't. I mean, one of the things, the New Deal with the 1933 Agricultural Adjustment Act, which was deemed unconstitutional and repassed as the 1936 Agricultural Adjustment Act, which created the sort of system of farm subsidies that still exists today. And I mean, it's changed a lot, but it's also functionally sort of the same. And what they tried to do with that was make sure when costs were rising and the commodity was losing its value in the market, they tried to sort of lock in the purchasing power of a farmer with an average of, like, I think 1914 to 1918, which was a real... So the thing I always say is, if it feels like Mississippi is stuck in the past, it's because it literally is. Like, if the market would have been allowed to work, I wouldn't have grown up there.
What do you mean?
If the market moved on, and for a lot of, I mean, frankly, most of them well-intentioned reasons, they decided for the government to basically prop up the American cotton industry.
Okay, got it.
And so, like it should have started its long, slow slide back to nature. And instead, I mean, it's still statutorily locked in. It's 1920 every day there.
When you're talking about mythology, and we're just talking about Mamie Till, and the amount of propaganda that woman took on by herself, the things that came out, there was that Look magazine cover story that is one of the most egregious pieces of magazine work. I mean,
it's unbelievable. Like William Bradford Huey. I mean, like, so the defense attorneys just wrote it, essentially.
Yeah.
But, like, so here's what the jury believed happened. The jury believed the defense's theory of the case, which was that the NAACP, in conspiracy with the Communist Party of Russia and China, had gotten a body out of a morgue and had thrown it in the Tallahatchie River after mutilating it, and had coached all of these witnesses to invent stories, and that Mamie Till had been bought off by the NAACP with the promise of a life insurance policy for her son, who was alive and well in Detroit, and that the body pulled out of the river was not Emmett Till. That was the defense. And that like they said, well, that seems more. And the whole reason any of that happened, according to the defense, was that the Communist Party was trying to overthrow America, and they were starting by attacking the good white people of Mississippi. That was it. That's the legal theory. Like when they tried to reopen the case in 2003 or 4, the reason they had to exhume his body is because they had to do a DNA test to prove that the body at the ground in Borough Cemetery was in fact Emmett Till, which of course it was. But like the Mamie Till, one of the jurors said in an interview immediately after the trial, if she'd have tried harder, she could have squeezed out a tear.
Yeah, I read that line.
Like, this is what I'm talking about. Like, I mean, I don't even know what to say. I mean, like, honestly, like, it just defies words.
It reads as propaganda. And part of what also feeds in, it's not just the economics of it all, right? Like, the economy's collapsing. People are losing their status. They're losing their money. But also, Brown versus Board of Education, that first decision has come down, and Mississippi loses its collective mind, insofar as I can tell.
Right. So the thing that most people don't understand is that one of the main drivers of the murder of Emmett Till were the 5 politicians who were running for governor of Mississippi in 1955. Because it was a race for the bottom to who could sort of be the most segregationist. So Brown v. Board was 54. They had to do Brown v. Board 2 in 55 to enforce it. That was Thurgood Marshall was representing the NAACP. That was all deliberate speed. That decision came down, I want to say, in July of 1955. Like 10 days later, Emmett Till gets on a train. He gets there on a Sunday. The following Tuesday is election day. I mean, in a state that has a history of rhetorically violent elections, this was probably the worst.
Yep.
And so that was a Tuesday. And the next day, they went to the store and Emmett whistled. And so, like, he had no idea that he was walking into something where politicians had been whipping people up into a frenzy. People took them at their word.
Yeah. I mean, 14 years old.
Yeah, just turned 14.
Mm-hmm.
I remember being a 14-year-old boy. It's the worst. And in
14-year-old girl is pretty close behind.
No, or worse. I mean, at least boys just go fight.
14 in general is not good.
Not good, dude. And so he was just a kid where you have U.S. combat veterans who think that the only way to protect their family's way of life is to torture a 14-year-old child. I mean, let's call it what it is. I mean, these guys were they were domestic terrorists.
But also the fact that the community was willing to defend those actions by burying them. I mean, honestly, by not saying anything, you are actually kind of, defending everything by saying, we're just going to pretend it didn't happen. No, you're definitely complicit. I mean, Mississippians want to believe that there were good people and bad people. Mm-hmm. And the actual story is there were brave people and there were cowards. And, if you've been in Mississippi as long as my family has, you got both. I've got 5 or 6 people who did incredibly brave things at risk to themselves. And then I got people I knew who just didn't want to get involved. And I understand. It goes back to the conversation I had with my mother, where I was just like, maybe you shouldn't pick a fight with these crazy people. She just is like silences complicity. You didn't pull the trigger, but, one of the things that I think the people who've read the book have told me that every time I point a finger at every time and place when someone could have stopped this. And each of those is pretty harrowing when you realize that if one person over 1,000 years would have been courageous, this whole thing could have been avoided. One person over and over. There were people who were put in a position to fundamentally alter the course of the Mississippi Delta. And then once we get much closer to 1955, this specific intersection. But, the book deals with both. It deals with the forces and the systems
that were pushing people into intersection, but it also deals with the lineage, the family trees, and the lives of those who were being pushed into intersection. So that, it attempts to do both.
The idea, though, that we could have lost Emmett's story entirely if it weren't for his mom and some folks in Chicago who were like, this is not happening on our watch. This is just not happening. You were coming to Willie Reed, and I have to tell you, I am not a teary person. I'm a half Japanese New Englander. It's not part of the factory settings.
No.
But when you take us to the point where he's escaping, but then he comes back, and I'm going to ask you to tell that story. He comes back to Mississippi for the first time in the early aughts, and I thought I was going to absolutely lose it as this elderly man stood in Mississippi.
I weep almost every time I tell it. Willie Reed was 18 years old on the morning of the murder, walking from his house on the Drew to Louisville Road to go get some stuff for his grandfather to cook for breakfast. He turned into the Milam place. The pickup truck turned directly in front of him. He hid behind a well and listened to them pistol whip him as, he cried out for his mom. He agreed to testify, which is suicide. And so he testified and then got so many death threats that he had to escape from Mississippi under the cover of darkness with only what he could carry. You have to understand, in 1955, you needed a family every 25 acres. So the rural South it wasn't urban, but it was populated. There were country stores and houses, and there were lots of people. And so he has to walk down to the highway from his gravel road. He does that. A car is waiting. The guy driving the car is Medgar Evers. They drive him to the Memphis airport, put him on an airplane, fly him to Chicago, has a nervous breakdown, changes his name, marries this beautiful woman, Juliet, who I know really well, who's still alive. She's great. They're married for like 12 years before she finds out about Emmett Till, and he doesn't ever want to talk about it. And then the FBI decides they're going to reopen the case, which means they're going to need him to testify. And so he comes back to Mississippi, and Willie Lewis is becoming Willie Reed again. And they drive him to the barn. And you got to understand, all of those tenant houses have been torn down. There used to be hundreds of them on that road, and now there are 2. And everything that he had known in the first 18 years of his life, everything and everyone, they were all gone, and any sign that they had ever been there at all was gone. But that barn was still there. And he stood in front of it. And Dale Killinger, the FBI agent, was a U.S. Army Ranger, 75th Ranger Battalion, combat veteran, the real thing. He said it's one of the most moving things he's ever seen in his life, because this old man lost his balance from the psychic weight of it, had to put his hands out. And Willie Reed did the right thing, and he wasn't rewarded for it one bit ever in this life. He got run off from everyone and everything he'd ever known. He moved to Chicago. He changed his name. His wife said that he had nightmares about it and would moan and cry in his sleep. When he started talking about it again, that didn't bring some catharsis. Life isn't a movie. He hated that it had been brought back up. And so it's just a reminder that there almost is never reward for doing the right thing. And his whole family had to move. His grandfather, every time he get really cold in Chicago, would always be like, I told you not to say anything. But there are a lot of people who lived in exile, and some of them are still alive. It's a terrible cliche that the past isn't dead. It isn't even past. And I would argue that in Mississippi, you really mess with the existence of time. I feel like, Nathan Bedford Forrest's brother lived right by the barn. And Nathan Bedford Forrest was a Confederate cavalry general and the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. His brother built the road that the barn is on. Nathan Bedford Forrest, the local history goes, marched his cavalry down that road right past where the barn would one day be. And I think in some sort of dimension that we don't understand, Nathan Bedford Forrest cavalry is coming from this direction, and J.W. Milam is driving his green and white pickup truck in this direction, and they just are continually passing. I want the experience of the book to put all of these places in like a timeless intersection because that's what it feels like there. And functionally, that's how life is run and that's how the systems work.
But that's also how history works, right? Like you've put the context back. You've put the context back to the rest of the story. Like we've all had pieces of the story, right? Like I had the piece that I was taught in elementary school and then the pieces that I got later as I was older. I have, you know, what I understand of Mississippi and all of these other pieces. And you have put all of the context back.
There's a sign in my office above my desk that I wrote for this book on a huge Post-it note, like the really big ones. And it just says everything is everything.
Yeah.
And it's like the degree to which all of this talks to each other. You start stacking up just the history of Township 22 North, Range 4 West alone. You've got the barn where Emmett Till was killed. You have a Native American city that Harvard has been doing archaeological digs on since 1941. You have the sunflower plantation that was owned by big New York industrialists that was bought by the Roosevelt administration for the SFA, one of the New Deal programs. You have Dockery Farms, where all serious music scholars say the blues was born, and therefore jazz, and therefore rock and roll, and every bit of protest music from Public Enemy to the Sex Pistols. You have pieces of Fannie Lou Hamer's Freedom Farm. You have one of the intellectual architects, if we can call him that, of Jim Crow had land there. Just outside of it in the 40s, there was a Nazi prisoner of war camp where they made Nazis work on the cotton plantations. And in case you were wondering, yes, the Nazis were treated much better locally than the black sharecroppers. The American history that intersects there, to me, makes these 36 square miles in the tradition of Will Campbell's Providence or in William Lee's Teen Moon. It makes these 36 square miles the Rosetta Stone for talking about all of American history. And so you have it all intersecting in this one piece of land. I
really love how grounded this book is. And I'm going to come back to Gloria Dickerson, though, because I'm absolutely wild for her and I'm completely in love with her. But I want to keep on this thread for a second of land, because land is what defines everyone in this community. Who has land, who doesn't have it, who can sell it, who's invested in it. It's almost as if you don't exist without land, right? And yet somehow everyone is connected. Even the sharecroppers, though, they'd rather be sharecropping some of them. And there's some harrowing stories in here where they would rather be because at least they know they can take care of their children in a way. And all of that gets thrown. It just disappears.
Mississippi was like I said, was always a colony for Manchester, Liverpool, London, and New York. So this was always about people from other places extracting profit margins and a caste system pushed and developed externally, but executed and owned and polished internally and locally. And then as cotton died, the reason for the caste system got disconnected from it existing. And instead of it dying out, the opposite happened, which is, say, from 1923 to 1955, it just kept ratcheting up. Like, once it was separate from the reason it had come to be, it was almost like it was allowed to become some new, twisted, thing. You brought up Gloria Dickerson, who her parents bravely integrated the Drew school system in 1965. Gloria had a long career in corporate America. She worked for Kellogg, and then she moved back when she retired because she realized that her parents had, her father used to have to lie on their roof with a rifle to defend their home. And when the plantation owner came to throw him out of the house, her mother got a record player and put it on the porch and played a record of the speech John F. Kennedy gave about civil rights. By the way, the next day is when Medgar Evers was shot. Just another link between violent political rhetoric in Mississippi and actual violence. I mean, these politicians who just want votes, it's disgusting. So you have, Gloria Dickerson, she talked to her great-grandmother, who was an enslaved woman, and she is now teaching kids today. Like, this isn't that long ago.
No, it's not.
And that came alive for me in a way that, I mean, I should know all this. I'm from here. I mean, it's a really scary thing when you realize you actually don't know the most fundamental thing about the place you know best in the world. Like, that's not a great feeling.
Yeah, but at least we got this book out of it. Sorry. I mean, no, I'm really serious. This is the kind of book, and I know I said this to you before we started taping, but this is the kind of book that changes conversations. And I feel that way about Patrick Radden Keefe's Empire of Pain, which, if you look at the opioid crisis in America, like, he does, not dissimilar to you, he follows the money. He follows the money. And it really does, in a lot of ways, start with the money. And then if you're protecting what you think is a birthright, everything goes off the rails.
So, like, the largest plantation in the Mississippi Delta, the Delta Pine and Land, that company once owned the land where the barn is.
Right.
It's the largest plantation in the Mississippi Delta. It was purchased in 1915 by the Manchester Fine Doublers and Spinners Association, which was the largest manufacturing conglomerate in the world. That has been split into several companies. It all still exists. One of them manufactures all the lingerie for Victoria's Secret and clothes for Marks and Spencer. And the another part of the company was sold to Monsanto, which has been bought by Bayer, which itself is owned by the parent company of the people who made Zyklon B.
Yeah, all of that is just ugly. All of it.
I mean, it's all money. Money's the only ethic is to reproduce itself.
Right. Right. Hey, I want to talk about craft for a second, though, because, I mean, you've given us, 300 years of history. I mean, the barn is 20 miles from Parchman Prison?
Less than that, maybe six.
Okay, so, I mean, the front door of Parchman Prison is not that far from the barn. Like, again, this goes back to the overlap you were talking earlier. I mean, if we don't know our own history, and I'm including myself in that, even though I did not grow up in Mississippi, it's still my history.
Well, the book is a map, because the book is full of maps, descriptions of maps, but the act of the book, of writing it and therefore of reading it, is a mapping. And it is saying you cannot see the Mississippi Delta, and therefore you can't see Mississippi, and to the real point, therefore you cannot see the United States of America unless you can see all of these different places at the same time.
Right.
And so you start stacking the maps. I mean, what the book is essentially a mapping of money and people moving through time and space. I mean, that's so if you're talking about craft, that's essentially all it is like the whole book as map. And like, that's how it was conceived.
Okay, but I'm going to add, as a reader, I'm going to add a little more in there, because I know John McPhee is a big influence for you, and he's a dear.
Very much.
I love that. Oh, I love that guy. McPhee's an influence for you. Willie Morris sort of changed your trajectory, because you were that kid who was like, get me out of here. I don't want to live here. And yet you get sent to 2 different boarding schools, and you're like, yeah, I don't want to be here either. So, I mean, it takes you a minute to find right, but it's journalism that gets you out of the place you don't want to be, and journalism that brings you back.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I learned all these things. I learned how to do something that has found its highest evolution to date in finally making sense of the place that I care about the most. I mean, you know, it was interesting. Like, I mean, this whole thing started as an ESPN story about something else. And then I got obsessed with it for 2 reasons, which is, 1, how could this just be someone's barn? And 2, how can this be 23 miles away from my farm and I don't know anything about it?
Right.
Like, how could both of those things be true? And what does it say if you don't really know home? So, no, I mean, and like, I love Willie Morris. His book, North Toward Home, is the thing for me. I mean, that book is incredible. You know, for this, I love Will Campbell's Providence. I loved William Louis T. Moon's Prairyerth. I like the idea of writing about land because it's so important. As you mentioned so astutely earlier, I mean, you can't see Mississippi until you can see the land. And by that, I literally mean like who owns it and why and when and where. You know,
I joke sometimes that I'm a New Englander in exile because I am not rushing. I have my life elsewhere now, but it is a place I carry around with me. Like, you don't shake that. None of us shakes where we're from. You know, we may end up with sort of the zeal of the converted when we find our new place, and then people assume we're just from the new place. And when I say new place, I mean, I've been back in New York now for a very long time, and I've met people who are like, wait, you're not a New Yorker? I'm like, no, well, I was a part-time New Yorker, but now I'm a full-time New Yorker. And so, I mean, place it's such a fundamental piece of who we are and who we become because of how we relate to it.
It's the question, I think. And like, you know, because human beings we're not evolved to travel as far and as fast as we can travel. I mean, it used to be you never really left. You didn't travel 15 months. Like evolutionarily, we're not designed to be global people. And in some ways, I think that like this is a whole separate conversation, and I'd love to talk. This is dime store psychology. I haven't thought this through at all, but like it does feel a little bit like a lot of our issues with rising tribalism and all of this are because the human psyche is not evolved enough to move like we move, and that like we're just not prepared for it. You know, one of the motivating things for me to do this was if I don't know my home, I'm not really from anywhere. And if I'm not from anywhere, then I really am not anyone. And if I'm not trying to learn about home, I'm not trying to learn about myself. And I'm essentially cosplaying my own life.
I'm going to add a layer to that for a second because
Please.
I want to talk about regret and shame.
Yeah.
And forgiveness. I mean, there's some folks in this book where I was not sad to hear that their ends were not pleasant. I will own that. There were some folks where I'm like,
the blow by blow of J.W. Milam dying. I've had that thought because you're pretty happy when Roy Bond is blind and scared.
You and I have both been on the planet long enough to know that when people get hit hard by shame, they lose their minds, right? It doesn't matter where the shame, it can be external, it can be internal. Shame is the thing that blows people up. Regret is the thing that you either work with or you don't, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, every 12-step program will tell you that addiction is really a disease of shame, and that the reason you keep relapsing is that you're hiding from the shame. The money planning company, Money Mississippi, famously is where Emmett Till whistled. You know, the money planning company was owned by Charles Merrill of Merrill Lynch. His grandchildren just made a donation to the Emmett Till Interpretive Center. Like, you know, that you carry this stuff around, and it doesn't need to be like, I don't like the performative sort of excavating a straw man ancestor to beat. They're not here to defend themselves. Either you deal with it yourself. I've always thought that if you can't count on your family members to protect you beyond the grave, then I'm not really sure what we're doing here. So I say that to say this. Like, you got to look them in the eye, and you got to know what they really did. You know, I have a family member in this book who, like, I mean, Thanksgiving's going to be bad. And, like, they don't know it's coming, really. I mean, I tried to, you know, and it's because this family member who was the president of a big segregation booster club, essentially in Mississippi, was inserting themselves into the 1955 news cycle over and over and over. And I just want to be like, so like when his great grandson calls me and starts screaming at me, which he's going to, I'm going to say, hey, look, I tried. He's the one who did it. And so you have to look back and say, like, you know, my father, who was a civil rights lawyer, we had a cross burned in our front yard in 1982. My father loved the song Dixie. Loved it, cried, reminded him of home. I grew up in a house where a cross was burned in our front yard. And until I was in high school, I had a bunch of Confederate flags. Like, my high school history teacher taught us, literally, this is true, that she called the Civil War the War of Northern Aggression.
Yeah, I've heard that phrase.
But we were taught that. If we are going to stand on a postage stamp of ground together and have a tribe of us, and we're going to have an American tribe, start with saying, this is what happened, and here's who did it. And here are these people in all of their complexity. I'd love to read the writings of Thomas Jefferson and think that we should be adding statues of him, not tearing them down, as controversial as that is, so that people can study the conflict within one human's heart. There aren't good guys and bad guys. We are all both. And so one of the things that was really fascinating in this was to read about the conflict in every human's heart over what was right and what was wrong, and to understand everybody from Thomas Jefferson to local citizens in Sunflower County in 1955 in Mississippi, to understand their own decision-making matrix, as you can see them talk themselves out of doing the right thing.
But aren't we supposed to evolve? I mean, as humans, aren't we supposed to evolve? I mean, we went from, agrarian nations to, I can't get beyond the fact that we are supposed to change and move forward. And how do we do that if we bury the past and say, oh, well, that didn't happen, or I'll just pretend. And again, I grew up in New England. I promise you, we're as good at this in some ways as Mississippians are in others, right? Everyone does it.
One of the most powerful moments in me recording this book is that within eyesight of the barn is called the Walford site, which is it was a Native American city, 800 BC. It was a monocrop culture. They farmed corn. They farmed it with slave labor. They captured their enemies, mutilated their enemies' feet so they couldn't run. The sacred sort of Indian mounds that we talk about now were where the elite built their houses so they could look down on everybody. That entire culture rose and fell. We don't know who they were. We don't know what language they spoke. They had built military facilities around the town, defensive walls with firing positions with perfectly interlocking fields of fire, really advanced stuff. We don't know who was fighting them. We don't know why they were fighting. We don't know who the good guys were. We don't know who the bad guys were. So you ask if we evolve, if we move forward. That entire history I described to you is played out twice now on the same piece of ground. We don't evolve. We're animals on a rock. And one of the hopeful things about the book, and I hope you picked up on this, was that the last act is the prayer for evolution. It's a prayer that let's not try to fix the world. Let's take this 136 square miles and let's see if we can stand on it together and look each other in the eye and call each other brother and sister.
I mean, shouldn't we take responsibility for the choices we make? I know you've got this cousin who's about to ream you, but at the same time, I'm kind of but your ancestor made these choices. The choices were made, the behaviors were done, the things were done. We don't undo them just because we don't like them.
I didn't do it. You know what I mean? I'm just pointing out what if he didn't want me, he should have thought about that before he did it. There's a degree of arrogance and smugness. Hubris, man, is the driver of all bad. I'm with you. You have to be able to stand up and say, this is what happened. This is who did it. Wheeler Parker was getting a literary tour of Mississippi once, and the tour guide pointed out the window and goes, and that's where Carolyn Bryant lives. And no one knew who he was. And he was just I wanted to go knock on her door. And she said, hi, I met your husband in the dark on Dark Fear Road on a Saturday night. But he was just until she died, they wanted an apology. Here's what I think, man. I think human beings, we all will be so willing to forgive almost anything. Mm-hmm. When somebody looks you in the eye and is I'm sorry. For me, we're good now. And you get the sense that if we could ever get to that sort of moment.
The cast of characters, and I'm using characters just in the literary sense, right? These are all real people, all heavily, but it is, you have to make choices about who appears in the book and how, based on the story, because you are sticking to the facts. And that's the one thing I want to keep coming back to is you did the research, you did the work, you have sat with maps. You were in Spain, and there are maps of this plot of land in Spain because the Spanish came, and then the French came, and then the English came. None of this is you sitting in the corner of your office saying, oh, I'm going to tell a story. It's, I have all of these facts. I have this information.
I'm a reporter. I wish I could write a novel. I have so much respect for people who can. I just, when I try to make it up, it's stupid. Real life is crazier to me You can't, this stuff that was happening, you can't make up. You know, I found the murder weapon, which was in a safety deposit box at a bank in Greenwood, Mississippi. Like, you can't make that. If I made that up in a novel, you would be like, oh, come on. Like, you know, I mean, and like, you'd be like, that's a James Patterson detail or something. You know what I mean? And so, you know, like, I'm a reporter. And so I went out. I wanted to know how a child got beat to death in a barn. And so I decided to really answer the question for myself, you know, and I hope that the book is about the journey of that. And I hope that like that comes through, but that was it. It was like, this is incomprehensible. And then I started reading about the history, and then it went in my own head from being incomprehensible to inevitable. And every time I would say that to people, they would kind of look at me funny. And so I was like, well, then I have to prove it, you know? And like the book is that attempt.
You and I are taping this a couple weeks before the book officially meets the world. And I've read it a couple of times now. And I will say, don't race through this book. This is not a single sitting read. You need to linger and you need to process. Also, Wright, your sentences are really beautiful. I will always give a sports writer that. Halberstam was a sports writer.
I know.
You know, you get the best and the brightest, but you also get the amateurs, and you get all of his basketball writing. Like, David Halberstam, come on. He was the guy for a really long time.
We had the same magazine writer and the same magazine editor and the same book editor, and they're different people.
That's a trip. That's a total trip.
Jay Lovinger was my first great magazine writer, and then Scott Moyers is the editor of this book.
And I want people to hold that as they read, because there are going to be people who get this book immediately and understand exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it. And then there are going to be some people who are like, I'm not touching that. There are going to be some people who are somewhere
Which is
in between.
Fair,
it's all fair. Yeah, it is all fair. But I'm looking for that one person who picks it up, and then the whole world just shifts. Because we can do that with books.
I'm looking for the idea that there is a new way forward and a new kind of patriotism. I don't know. Because in the end, I'm talking about it like it's some self-help thing. I don't mean that because it's just a story. But I do have high hopes for what it might do in the soul of someone who reads it.
I mean, like I said, I'm not from Mississippi, but I'm an American, and this is part of my story too, right? Like, all of it. Fred Hampton, there's a connection between Fred Hampton and Emmett Till.
The fact that Emmett Till's grandfather and Fred Hampton's father gardened together is unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's the way you think about music, the way you think about there's a big thread on the evolution of the blues and how the way in which it's been studied by the sort of folk tradition obscures how revolutionary it was when it happened, where you had powerless people in a caste system singing first-person songs about their oppressors by name. That's a hell of a thing to do in 1919.
Yeah.
Calling out the overseer by name on a record that sells a lot. I love the way that the stories of life in this square of land naturally spoke to each other. I was a little worried when I started doing it. How's this all going to fit? I cut it pretty severely.
Mm-hmm.
And it was much harder than I thought it would be because there were things that I thought were load bearing that I'm all of this needs to go. It's itching. No, the first draft was 287,000 words and it's running at 107.
Okay. I don't feel like I'm missing any load bearing pieces.
No, you're not.
Yeah. Okay.
I was wrong. I just was in love with
all right.
things.
Just check.
No.
You can love a place and see it for what it is, right? You can still be from a place and know exactly what the history is.
If you can't see it for what, well, I would say this. I would say that almost the opposite is true too. If you can't see it clearly, then you don't actually love it.
Yeah.
Maybe you're in lust with it. I don't know the right way to say it, but you don't love it. Because the answer is, of course, all of us, formed in the image of and the broken image of God. Like, all of us are both. And so, I mean, I don't understand it to be like the most patriotic thing in the world to watch the continued failures and then retries of Americans to live up to the American experiment. It would seem to me that it would be an incredibly patriotic thing to see a country where people even try to do stuff like this, as opposed to the history of those failures somehow being an assault on that patriotism. I just find it all. I just think anybody like when somebody says that, my first thought is you're just weak. You're just weak. Like, if you can't like love a place and have a rigorous conversation about it, you're just weak.
Nostalgia can be a drug of its own, right?
Was it come from the Greek for homesick and pain?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
For home and pain? Yeah.
And again, I'm not saying ignore your history. I'm not saying there wasn't some great stuff that came out of I am not. All I'm saying is keep a clear eye and look at what's there. That's all I'm asking. That's literally all I'm asking. And that's what you do in this book, right? That's what you do.
Well, it's also hard to argue with it the way it's laid out. I mean, this is just everything. It's all true. There is no, there's not an opinion. Like, this is just what happened, good and bad. There's real comfort in that. And this is just what happened. And if we don't want it to keep happening, you have to learn about it. And I don't want to spoil it, but the way that all of these things dovetail into each other is pretty shocking when you see it start to happen on the page. There's a sense, at least I got when I went back and read it, of building momentum where you start to realize it's almost like when I read Overstory, when I realized what he was doing.
Yep.
And you're like, halfway through the third one of those things, I was like, oh my God, is this? And so I feel like there's that moment where you start to be like, if all of this connects at the end, my head's going to explode. And then it does.
That is exactly what you pull off. And I think that might be the place to end. You know what? You and I could do a whole separate podcast on the psychology of some of the stories that you have in this book. But I'm also really concerned that we not give away any of the details, because you have that journalist eye. You find that thing. And sometimes I'm just like, I don't know where you found it. Other times I can look at it and go, yeah, you were talking to someone and you were paying attention when they said something and you were really listening. So what I do hope is that readers come to the barn with really an open heart and an open mind. I think you've done a really important thing with this book, and I think it really is going to stand in a way that is so interesting and conversation changing. And, don't race through it. Just don't race through it. So, Wright, thank you so much for joining us. And the barn is out now.
Very exciting. Thank you so much. This was really fun.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.